Okay. Paul, it's been so great getting to know you in the Liberty Ventures Network, but honestly, I don't even think I could fully explain what exactly it is that you do myself right now. So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to better be able to explain what you're up to, even myself. But why don't you go ahead and just give the 30-second elevator pitch for what exactly you're helping businesses out with these days?
Sure. I call myself a forensic 401k consultant because the fee structure is so opaque. Nobody understands the fees that are actually being passed on to the participants in these 401k plans. And that's how they're paid, not from the employer, but from the participants. And when I would call business owners, I started this 20 years ago, and they would tell me they're not paying anything, their plan is free, and their friend handles it. I knew I could make a living just consulting in this one area.
So let's break that down. Most people have a 401k or they've at least heard about it. This great
Yes.
program to help with retirement, to get tax benefits for planning out your retirement. But where can that go wrong for people? Just sounds really good.
Yeah, it sounds good, but what people don't realize is that there are no invoices being sent. And I've argued in a mini book I recently wrote that the market never fully formed because in any functioning market, there should be invoices, there should be some renewal moment, some kind of mechanism to help plan sponsors, people who handle these retirement plans, understand that there are fees being regularly charged. And this happens typically on a monthly or a quarterly basis. And what really goes wrong is that as the account grows in value, the fees are based on a percentage of the overall assets, the total account value. So even though there are no additional services provided, as the account grows, all of the service charges increase without, again, any additional work being performed.
So this almost sounds to me like the same kind of issue that we have with the healthcare system in America being so closely tied to employers rather than individuals being responsible for their own health insurance, which is also a government structured setup. Is
Yes,
that a good analogy here?
yes, that's actually a perfect analogy because what I've argued is it's actually the inventor of the 401k. His name is Ted Benna. And he invented the 401k because he discovered a loophole in the tax code, I believe in the early 80s, that allowed executives to defer compensation on a pre tax basis. He was just trying to help his clients figure out better ways to save for retirement. And slowly that became the primary pillar for our retirement system. But I've argued that any system that's born out of tax engineering is inherently a system where a market cannot fully form. And if we did have a truly free market in retirement plans, I don't think the plans would have ever been tied to the employers in the first place because the moral hazard that results is that the people who make the decisions as to which service providers are being used and what prices they're going to charge, they don't bear the economic consequences, at least a very small portion of them, because the fees are spread out through amongst all the participants. It's not that primary decision maker that's bearing the majority or even a small amount of the cost in many cases.
Okay, let's nerd out on the free market side of this before we get into what we do with the
Yeah.
imperfect system that we have right now. What for those of us who believe in free market capitalism, do you think would be a better ideal to strive for when it comes to retirement planning?
Yeah, I've struggled to try to answer this because I've tried to imagine what would a retirement plan system even look like. But I would start by saying I don't think it ever needs to be tied to employers. That's number one. And all these convoluted rules that we have in terms of getting our money out, in terms of having a 10% penalty, for example, if we withdraw before we're at the age of 59 and a half, and that applies to our IRA as well, in terms of getting refunds if the non highly compensated employees, if you're a highly compensated one, don't contribute enough relative to people like you. There's these rules that's called discrimination testing, and it's supposed to make things fair. But whether or not other people are contributing as much as you are, and maybe you have more money or you're earning more, really has no bearing on the outcomes of the non-highly compensated participants. So those are two really clear examples of how a lot of the rules really don't help participant outcomes at all. And I think they're just rules for the sake of being rules, just to make it seem like somebody is doing something.
That makes a ton of sense to me, actually, because one of the biggest problems that we talk about the problem in the healthcare system all the time, that the recipients of the services are not the ones who are choosing their insurance or who have actual
Yep.
control of what they're doing. You're right to point out that this is happening in the retirement space as well, which is scary and is certainly an impediment to people taking control of what their retirement actually looks like and being able to maximize the benefits they're actually looking for.
Yes, and I will add that I have 17 years worth of empirical data. So all of these fees are actually publicly available, or most of them are, on what's known as Form 5500, which is the tax form filed with the Department of Labor. So for the last 17 years, almost daily, I've been scouring through the database of publicly available tax forms just throughout the Chicago area alone, where I am. And I have this whole spreadsheet where I've segregated out over 1,300 examples of companies passing on excessive and often egregious fees to the plan participants. And this is both before and after the 2012 fee disclosure rule took effect, basically showing that rules mandating fee disclosure did not have their desired effect. And the reason that happened is because they forced companies to produce a document that nobody really looks at carefully or understands, disclosing fees, but there are still no invoices being sent. And it's the invoice that would be the market mechanism to force people to confront the cost in real time on a regular basis. And because that didn't happen, then the excessive fees continue.
So, how did you even get onto this in the first place, Paul? This is the first time I'm hearing about this from anyone when you and I met. And it seems like such an egregious problem, actually. Was there a personal experience that you went through that brought you onto this, or what's your origin story here?
Yeah, and I've been thinking about how to tell that origin story. That's another really great question. So, a colleague of mine, about 21 years ago, I still remember the conversation, told me how you can look up companies' tax forms online. And I just couldn't believe that information was a matter of public record, but I didn't know what to do with it until a few years later. I thought, you know what? I'm just going to call a few business owners. And when I see excessive fees or fees that are just seem really high in proportion to the number of participants and show me that I don't know anybody that could possibly be doing that much work. And if you would have gotten a bill, you probably wouldn't have paid that amount. I'm going to let these business owners know. I thought I'd be a hero, but what they told me is, oh no, I'm not paying anything at all. And I would say, I know you're not. It's the participants, mainly you as the largest participant, who's paying these fees. And they'll say, oh, my friend handles that. And I'll say, no, your friend is the one who's taking the money. So when I'd have conversations like this, I knew there was such a problem that I could make a living and focus my entire career just on tackling this one issue.
Ingenious. And so now let's actually talk about how exactly you're doing that. So who are your customers? Is it the businesses themselves or
Yes.
the individuals who hold the 401ks? Okay.
Yes, good, another good question because it's not always clear. I've even talked to other financial advisors that don't even realize that there are financial advisors that just deal with 401k plans, providing advice at the level of the plan where the client is the actual business. So my clients are all sorts of industries, manufacturers, distributors, professional service firms. I have a law firm client, and the professional service firms are getting hurt the most because they have the most money. They have high earners. They're putting in lots of money in because, again, there's no invoice and the fees are primarily asset based, meaning it's based on how much money is in the account. The more money that is put into the account, the more the account grows. And these firms don't have that many people, which is really what drives the amount of work, is how many participants. Therefore, these firms are getting massively overcharged, and it keeps getting worse every year because the contributions, not even the market itself, are pushing up the account balances.
So it's the companies themselves. Why do the companies really care about this? Is this because they care about their employees and want to make sure they're getting the best deal there, or are the companies themselves actually paying a higher premium than they should be?
It's all, and the answer is they don't, because the fees, they don't even know. And this is a great question because this gets into why don't employers pay the fees instead of the participants? It's because they don't know and they've never gotten an invoice. So it never occurred to them. But here's where we can geek out a little bit on taxes, but I think I can explain it clearly. The fees are passed down in proportion to the account value. So who has the highest share of the fees? It's the owners, the partners. Well, they're paid with non-tax deductible dollars. So not only are they excessive, the partners can't even get a tax deduction. Actually, nobody can. But if they would have paid at the employer level, it would be a tax deductible business expense like anything else. They would mitigate their liability because liability has to do with excessive fees passed on to plan participants. And of course, they would be more sensitive to the cost. When you get a bill for $50,000, you might want to find out if the advisor actually performed $50,000 worth of work. And they usually don't when there's 10 or 20 people in a plan, so they would never otherwise have paid those exorbitant fees that they never saw if they were directly billed. Oh, and by the way, they could actually deduct those expenses too in a much lower amount.
So this is one of the beautiful things about capitalism when owners and employees are in the same boat, quite literally here with the same 401k plans. There's a mutual incentive to have the lowest fees because everyone is paying into that. Everyone is being harmed by excessive fees, the lack of transparency here. And so the owners have an incentive beyond just the best interests of their employees to be involved in fixing this.
Well, yes, they should. And this gets into Milton Friedman's, since we're talking about capitalism, Milton Friedman's chart. You might be familiar with his chart, The Four Ways to Spend Money. You can spend your own money on yourself. You can spend your own money on someone else. You can spend someone else's money on yourself, or you can spend someone else's money on somebody else. The latter is the worst because not only do you not economize, but you also don't seek the highest value. We're always more sensitive to our own money being spent on ourselves, where we care not only about price, but we also care about quality. Whereas when it's not our money and we're not even spending it on ourselves, or primarily not, then we have very little incentive to care. Not to mention the employer's bottom line isn't being effective and it's not even efficient tax wise.
And there are so many times when individual businesses seem to operate like government bureaucracies, or at least if you just take out the word government, they are
Yeah.
literally bureaucracies. And so you run into the same problems, whether it's in a private institution or a public institution, that we need to be on guard for. And that's what you're tackling here, it sounds like.
Yes. It's probably more so, ironically, with the big businesses. Now, the big businesses to actually who do operate more like bureaucracies don't actually get overcharged very much or at all because the cost per person, because of economies of scale, is so much lower. This is really the problem with the smaller businesses, which can also operate like bureaucracies, but they're small enough where they actually can make these changes very easily if they just knew what was going on. I believe 91% of all 401k plans are with plans of 100 employees or fewer, and that's where the excessive fees are primarily concentrated.
Interesting. So, how does an owner who has a 401k plan set up for the company go about figuring out if they're being overcharged here?
Well, they can first look up their own tax form, which they can either find online, which would be ironic because they should have it at their desk. But it's the Department of Labor. You can go all the way back to 2009. If you just Google DOL Form 5500 search, the link to search for any plan will come up. And it literally just begins with asking your service providers, can you give me an accounting of what you've gotten paid, not in percentages, but in dollars every year, let's say for the last 3 years. And I want to tell a very quick story of a plan who I talked to. It's not a client, just a conversation, who paid out approximately $49,000 in commissions to a broker from 2019 to 2024. I knew this because I looked at the tax forms, but the owner didn't even know he had a broker, which is another way of saying an advisor, which is crazy that all that money was paid out and he didn't even know he had an advisor. But then they wanted to know who it was. So his HR director called the administrator of the plan to find out who the advisor was. They got the name, Googled the advisor's name, and learned that the advisor had actually been dead since 2014. Now, if that doesn't show the insanity of the industry, I don't know what does. But my point about invoices therefore stands. This is the example more than any other example that shows that if they would have gotten regular invoices from the advisor's firm showing those fees, a dead advisor getting paid for, and this was just at the end of last year, 11 years never would have happened.
Okay, that is a great wild example. What are some other situations that you've run into where you've seen where this excessive fees and the lack of transparency has really been a problem for businesses?
Well, I spoke with another sponsor of a plan, a business owner. And again, a lot of these examples aren't even clients. These are just people I've called to explain these things to. And his advisor, he didn't even know what his advisor was getting paid. And it turned out he only has like, a handful of participants in the plan. He doesn't even use the advisor's services, but it's someone he's friendly with. So he didn't want to get rid of the advisor. Usually when it's someone's friend, they don't, want to mess with the compensation. But I explained to him, you might want to ask. And it turned out the advisor was getting paid about $15,000 a year for almost no services. And I said, hey, you know what? You can negotiate those fees. Well, it turns out that the advisor's firm forced him to charge a certain minimum. And this is one of those hidden conflicts of interest and problems with the way in which these arrangements are made that causes people to overpay. He couldn't, according to his firm, charge less unless he got a special exception. Well, the owner demanded that he get that special exception. And I don't know what the fee arrangement that was negotiated was, but I think it was something like 80% less. And I believe he decided to pay at the employer level for the reasons I stated. And again, because there's not enough knowledge flowing, because the feedback loops are closed, and because we don't have a functioning market, information is not flowing sufficiently freely enough for plan sponsors to be able to make these informed decisions and to ask pointed questions that would essentially lower their fees dramatically.
Okay, so very tangible results here that can add up very quickly for businesses. Um, but I have to ask, what about for companies who, or for startups in the Liberty Ventures ecosystem, they're thinking about setting up their first 401k for their employees? What would you recommend that they pay attention to try and avoid this problem from even starting in the first place?
Oh, sure. If you, and the fees are not as big of a deal when you're a startup because there's just not that much money in the plan. But I'd be careful about hiring a financial advisor that gets, let's say, 0.75%, which sounds like nothing when there's hardly any money. But what happens is that the assets ultimately grow and the percent doesn't change. So while the fee might be very low in the early years, when you don't get an invoice, though, that advisor fee ultimately becomes disproportional to the services that are often required, especially if there's only a few employees. And there's a firm, I'll name the firm, it's called Employee Fiduciary. They're a very low cost firm of record keeping, providing record keeping and administration services. And that's a great firm for startups to use, not only because of their cost, but because they've improved their technology and they don't have any restrictions on the investments. You're careful about how you pay the advisor, you use a low cost firm that's flexible. It's a great way to start your plan.
Okay, this is already super helpful, but what have we not covered yet that you think is really important for others in the network to keep in mind?
I would say just thinking about, which funds to select, and this gets into a lot of capitalism discussions too. Very few plans have access to precious metals like gold and silver. And I know there's a lot of people in the space that are starting to pay attention to those types of investments and the destruction of the not only the value of the dollar, but currencies all over the place. And the best way ultimately in an environment to protect yourself against deterioration of currency is to own something that's actually real money. Now, it's not the physical gold and silver you can own, but just know that through a company like Employee Fiduciary, I have no financial affiliation with them, or another company that doesn't restrict the investments, you can have those types of investments like gold and silver or other commodities in your plan. It's something you should really think about.
Paul, I love that you're bringing transparency into a system that where there is significant government intervention that makes it really difficult for people to know how much they're being charged, and working with businesses to figure out how to just make the most of everything they're providing for their employees and everyone involved. If anyone wants to reach out to you to talk about how they can check and see what's going on with their 401ks, how can they do so?
I would just go to my website, Paul Sippil, PaulSippil.com. I have a mini book I wrote. It's called The Missing Market, right next to the About section on the site. My contact information is on there. There's a litany of information about 401ks if you wanted to learn.
Amazing. Thank you for everything you're doing, Paul. Thanks for taking time to share this on the Liberty Ventures podcast.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
Awesome.